It's been called a national scandal. Thousands of people who bought homes as leaseholders without realising that agreement included extra costs or rising charges. Sean Farrington, it's one we've been following here on 5 Live.
It has for a few weeks, for a few months. There's been a growing problem over recent years that new build homes, particularly where there are ground rents growing pretty quickly, sometimes doubling every 10 years or so. Today, the government's launching an 8-week consultation over plans to stop what it's calling unfair leasehold practices in England, particularly. Sajid Javid is the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. Joins us now. Good morning, Mr. Javid.
Good morning.
In your piece in The Times today, you list lots of examples of where people have been really quite hard hit by increasing ground rents. What are you going to be doing for them?
Well, what we've announced today is really to look at this whole practice of leaseholding for both flats and houses, and just to make sure that it is much fairer than it is today, but particularly around houses. And so we have seen in the last few years the number of houses, so as opposed to flats, that are being sold on leasehold really rocket to something like 10,000 last year for no good reason. And what we set out in the consultation is measures that we could take, but we also say very clearly if there's other ideas out there that people have, then we also want to listen to those.
But do you have any ideas about what you could do for those that have already suffered?
Yes, of course. So I mean, one thing that is already happening, and I hope that today's announcement will encourage, is that some of the more responsible developers out there have already taken action, and they've looked back to past sales. So Taylor Wimpey, for example, has set aside £130 million to help customers that have bought leasehold houses.
But that's off their own back, isn't it? That isn't because the government has told house builders to do this. So
I do think actually part of the reason why that is happening, and I hope to see more of it, is because the government has made this a real big issue where we will be cracking down and taking action. But also we need to do more than that, absolutely. And that's why we've also set out in the consultation ways that we can strengthen the consumer rights and the redress process for those people that are already in these leases.
Do you think it could be a big mis-selling issue like we saw with the PPI mis-selling scandal?
I don't want to prejudge that. That kind of judgment should be done independently. But what I will say, and I think it's perfectly correct to give examples of where I think any reasonable person looking at it would think that this just cannot be right. For example, I've seen cases where someone who's bought a house on leasehold is then handed over a bill of £1,500 just because they wanted to make a small alteration to their house.
But you're still relying on the house builders themselves to do anything with those who've already suffered. You're not telling them you must do this, you must give them back their money.
Well, we are in terms of those people that are currently in leases, and we estimate these are houses that have been sold on leasehold. There's over 1 million of them, and we will be looking at this consultation what we can do further to help them. What we also want to do is to make sure going forward that these kind of sales do not take place, and the intention is to ban the sale of houses on leasehold going forward. There may be the sort of really rare sort of exceptional circumstances where that's the only way. So if it's land that's owned by the National Trust, for example.
There may be a few little exemptions, but generally
we're going to ban
leaseholds
it.
On
we will ban it. And
quick
also
question,
also on ground rent, if I may say so.
Well, can I just ask you a question on electrification of rail lines? Because between Manchester and Leeds, it was a major policy of the governments that you've been involved in. What did you make of the current Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, watering down those plans? And then a couple of days later, we hear backing for Crossrail 2.
Well, I think that when it comes to major infrastructure projects, you've always got to have the right priorities. And I think what Chris has announced last week in terms of reviewing those plans, and especially when it comes to rail and prioritising those that are going to make the biggest difference, I think is the right approach.
You were a big backer of that electrification, though.
I'm a big backer of modernising our infrastructure, and that includes whether it's our rails, our roads, our bridges. But what I'm also a big backer of is a strong economy, because I also know that the only way that we can pay for this kind of modernisation is to keep our economy strong. And that's something certainly that we've seen in the last 7 years.
Can I just ask you for a little bit of clarification on another point, if you don't mind, while you're with this, Sajid Javid?
Yep.
On the 20th of July, you've told the Commons that not a single local authority or housing association approached you or your department to ask for any assistance following Grenfell in respect to fire safety issues. Well, we now know that wasn't the case. We know that Brent Council, Birmingham, Croydon, Southwark and Southampton all requested financial help. So why did you say it was otherwise?
Well, clearly those letters that they'd sent had not got to me, and it's not unusual in a department that when someone sends you a letter, it doesn't arrive to you to the minister on that same day. But now that we have those letters...
Well, they sent a letter on the 13th of July, and a week later you said that you hadn't heard
those letters had not got to me. That does not mean the department's not working on that. And what would normally happen is the department
on an issue as crucial as fire safety in the wake of the worst tragedy we've seen in this country in recent decades, council saying we desperately need financial assistance, and those letters aren't being passed to you?
No, what we've been absolutely clear on with every council, whether it's Brent or any other council, and we've told them this directly in communications to every council, I've said it in the House of Commons numerous times, is that whatever action is required to make their properties safe that's recommended by their local fire and rescue service, they must take that action. And if they cannot afford it, then the government will support them.
Would you say that's a failure within your own department that those letters hadn't got to you?
No, I would say if there's any council out there that hasn't taken necessary action, and I don't believe there is, from the information I have, is that every council has done what their local fire and rescue service has recommended, as we would expect them to. But if there isn't one because they were worried somehow whether they're going to afford it, when I've already said that we would help them in those circumstances, then that would be a failure. But luckily, I'm not aware of that kind of situation.
Okay. Sajid Javid, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.